start with a couple of disclaimers. What I'm about to say in this presentation is very much my personal opinion that I've formed as a result of doing some work with Power Automate and the underlying services. Thanks very much. And also, you may, I hope not, you may spot glimpses of confidential documents or whatever, and so please respect the confidentiality if that happens. Quick word about Zühlke, the company I work for. We're essentially now trying to morph ourselves from a technology company into a business transformation organization. And that's already happening on a fairly major scale with some of our major clients. So what we're doing is providing the technological support and the early consultancy to enable people to have transformation programs for their business and compete in the world of tomorrow. We're split up into a number of different areas of expertise, market sectors and technologies. So we've built as currently around a dozen practices, which are AI and data, digital consulting, digital experience, software excellence, and so on, which includes quality control, quality assurance. The bit I work in, these practices have been amalgamated as cloud and DevOps. And there's also cybersecurity, something to do with embedded devices. And the market units are things like finance, government, healthcare, and everything else. We're a medium-sized organization with something like 1,700 full-time professionals in 17 or so countries. There's lots of different profiles and specialisms. We're international, so we have centres in the Far East, the Middle East, Europe, and we're going to be opening one in the States before very long, so we can cover all the time zones. And there's a shared culture which has been built up since the company was founded in 1968. So it's going a while. Within Europe, we have got a number of what we call global delivery centres. This is kind of nearshoring. We've also got offshoring in the Far East, Vietnam, Singapore, Hong Kong. I think there's another office being opened in either Cambodia or Vietnam shortly. So, you know, what these GDCs allow us to do is to concentrate technical excellence in places where the labour costs are cheaper than they are in Europe. And we tend to build mixed teams, staffed partly from there and partly from the delivery country in each case, so that we've got contact with online. About me, I joined Zühlke 22 years ago, initially as a contractor, and then, you know, as an associate, work on contracts, and then full-time. And I've worked in lots of different roles. Currently, I'm in DevOps and AI. I'm told that that combination of things is called LLM Ops. So the project I'm currently on is a technology demonstrator, which I'll be talking about in more detail at DevOps London Exchange, DevOps Exchange London meetup, which takes place in 3 weeks' time, 27th of February.
There was a DevOps talk here last week.
Yeah, there's lots of it going on. The specific aspect of it is DevOps and AI, the intersection of those two. I've worked with lots of really peculiar software tools in the history of my career, and I generally get them to do ultimately what we need in some shape or form. Sometimes that's not necessarily the actual best approach. In the pub afterwards, I can tell you about some really funny experiences there. I'm a reasonable, competent tenor, both as a soloist and choir, and I love singing choirs. I also love science and technology, aviation and spaceflight particularly, and I'm quite family oriented, 2 grandchildren now, and love visiting them, playing with them. And something that I may have been inadvertently stumbled upon, you know, the idea of networking. So right from early days in my career, I started attending meetups and things like that. And this is how I came into the. I was interested in object-oriented programming at the time, which was new. I discovered there was this thing called OOPS, which was kind of allied with the BCS, and I went along to some meetings and I found it fascinating how people driving the technology forward. And I've been building up my network of contacts ever since, and it's really stood in very good stead, particularly when it comes to finding opportunities and asking for technical advice. Okay, so that's enough about me and about Zühlke. Let's see what we're going to talk about tonight. I contend that this is one of the worst software development ecosystems that you can imagine, and I'll explain why. Let me just see if somebody's asking something in the chat. Okay, no, that's all right, that was earlier. So why did we do this project, and why did we choose Power Automate as the tool? That's the first item on the agenda, and then I'll give you a little demo of what it is. Then I'll talk about the development environment in which you have to develop applications in this language. And there's quite a few things to trip you up, which really the value of this presentation should be to help people avoid those gotchas and traps. Okay, so point one, the project and why Power Automate. So within Zühlke, as I suspect in every large organization, there's a specific set of problems around understanding what we know and who knows it. So within our sales organization, somebody set up a SharePoint library to collect documents. And pretty soon it grew very large and nobody could find his way through it. So we tried to re-implement that, but in a sort of more disciplined way. So our global library of sales and delivery assets is called Glosada, and that's kind of nice because in Portuguese it means glossary. It's an electronic document library. It's full of reusable assets. There are spreadsheets in there, presentations, Word documents, even a few source code files. What's important about it is there's ownership, there's a life cycle, and it's searchable. So there's an index. And because every document has one or more owners, there's somebody responsible for making sure it stays relevant. Yeah, as I said, there's ownership. The second thing was that we realized that you want an audit trail. You want to know who changed what and when. So you can go back to earlier versions and, if necessary, rescue content from there. Hello again, good to see you. It's also secure, and this is where I came in because I have some sort of dotted line responsibility to our security practice. And the security practice was asked to investigate whether there were any risks involved with this, security risks involved with this SharePoint library. And we had a look at it and we came up with some points. Data protection is very important. People need to understand which of those assets come into which kind of classification. And we wanted to make sure that there's some kind of a filter, some kind of an approval system before things get published for them to use. We also wanted to make sure that if we're working together on a proposal or a project with external partners, that they can be given access to specific selected documents within this thing and even update them. So then we set about working out how we can do this. It was quite keen, the sales people were quite keen to make sure that what they'd already developed wasn't lost. And what they had developed was a sort of classification scheme. We added this sensitivity classification in the first column after name. But things like asset type and best of and so forth, those had already been identified and they were designed to ensure that you can filter and search on various criteria such as, who owns it, which business does it relate to, which market sector, and so on. Just go back one. Okay, so this is basically what it looks like. I'm not showing you the real Glossada, I'm showing you a test site, which is a mirror thereof, sort of analog thereof, which I'm using to develop new versions of Glossada. And I'll come to the reason for that soon. But that's the kind of face that it presents, and you can see at the top left there's a warning saying some files are missing required metadata. This is important because we want to make sure that every file has an owner and every file has a classification. But heritage documents, the legacy documents that we got from the existing repository didn't have those. So SharePoint, when you make a field mandatory, it immediately flags that up. We had to provide user documentation, and the way in which we did that was to create a Confluence page as an index. So each of these speech bubbles leads to a different page of documentation, each of which also contains an embedded little video demonstrating how to use it. And you can go straight to the video pages at the top of the front corner there. We found this kind of a map gives people a great handle on you know, this is what I want to do. Give me some help about it. Okay, so the most important part we wanted to implement was this approvals workflow, and you have to approve new documents, changes to existing documents, and deletions. So how do you do that? Well, if you go to automate on the top menu of SharePoint, there's something called rules, but we couldn't actually see any way to easily make that do what we wanted. So we looked further, and there's an integrate menu under which you got Power Automate. Oh, create flow. Okay, so let's try this out. And when you do that, when you click that create a flow, you get a huge bunch of templates. And initially, we found it difficult to select one, tried various ones, and saw what they did, amended them, and then found that really we wanted to start again with a blank sheet of paper, not using one of these templates, but using the knowledge we gained as to the type of things that happen in the workflow without those. So stepping back for a minute, what is Power Automate? Essentially, it's an orchestration tool which allows you to combine or create workflows, business processes in the form of consequential steps, and it supports basic ideas of loop and if-else type of branching, and it's entirely visual. You can't, even though there is actually a textual representation for these workflows, you can't modify them directly. You have to go through the visual editor. So if I show you what that looks like, I need to share this screen, don't I? Let me just hide windows I don't want. Okay. So I'm going to share something else now. Okay, so this is the representation. I think I need to blow that up a little bit. Can everybody read that? Okay. So this is like the overview of a flow, and this one's called start and approval when a file is added. And you'll see there's things like connections here, which I can edit. These are the various connectors to cloud services that Microsoft provides as part of Office 365, or just Microsoft.com type services. These are the co-owners of the flow, and there's a sort of AI assistant that's supposed to help you improve the flow. They can be linked together as well, so you can associate other flows with this one. But the most important thing here is edit. So if we look at this is the new designer view of the editor. So there's a traditional one as well, classic. And we've got automatically supplied for your Copilot, which comes up with helpful suggestions or not. I've found that using GitHub Copilot as part of, for example, IntelliJ IDEA, is quite good because it hits you with suggestions. You type a comment, it sort of suggests a block of code to fulfill that requirement, and you can then accept or reject it or modify it to suit. In this environment, I found it less than helpful because you sort of ask it a question in the chat. You know, how would I change so and so? And it goes away and modifies half a dozen nodes for you, and most of the time you don't want those changes. So the only choice you then have is to abandon this edit and come back in. So this is why I say save often. But let's dismiss Copilot. You can see here, this says when a file is modified, created or modified. And this is a really misleading title. You choose these up on menu. You need to have a node that kicks off the flow, right? So this one says, whenever a file is created or modified, give me back the properties of that file. That's what it is. And then we can initialize a whole load of global variables. And finally, we've got to try catch. And this is crucial. It took me a while to discover this, but you can nest these as well. What you have to do, by default, each of these nodes is executed if the preceding one succeeded. But in the case of catch, we want all the exception conditions. So if it's timed out, skipped, or failed, the block before, then we want to run this catch block. And that's a good way of kind of delimiting what happens. So if we expand that, you see it saying, find me the list of SPOCs, which is single points of contact, one for each business unit, and then do something with each one of those, etc., etc. So at any one of these points, it could fail, and in which case we wanted to jump into the catch block. It's impossible in practice to actually branch to a sort of failure condition after every action. We do it. Here again, you see this to attempt bit. It says we're going to set an approval variable, which is declared globally, set it to timeout, thinking we might time out, then wait for an approval. And if I click on that, you can see that settings. Yeah, so this waits for 5 minutes. This isn't a test. This is a test site, so I don't want to wait 5 days or whatever for the real timeout. You have to use this ISO 8601 format to specify time intervals, which is not great. There's a retry policy. By default, it's a kind of exponential back off. For some of the actions, I've set a retry policy of try it 5 times with 20-second intervals because we don't want to wait any longer than that. You do have to, on certain of these actions, you do have to cater for the fact that there might be sort of brief outages in services or network interruption or whatever. So you do want to retry. You don't want to retry sort of off forever. And this says what condition you run. So the preceding one was set approval variable. And as I said before, if you do a code view, then it's possible to see how this is represented in the Power Automate database, but you can't actually amend this. It's not editable. There's a testing tab, but we never got around what that's for. Static result, or who knows. The best way to test actually is to run the workflow and see what happens. So as you can see, if the approval succeeds, then we set the approval response variable to the response that we got. Otherwise, we send off a reminder email. You see that says one have to wait for approval timed out, but not if it failed. Then we send a reminder email out and wait for another 2 days, or in this case 5 minutes. If that succeeds, then we set the approval response variable. In all other cases, you can see that it says that this set approval variable runs in all cases except if timed out, except if it's failed. If the block above has completely failed, then we don't do this, but otherwise we set the approval variable to whichever the approval response was. Now let's see, this might show, yeah, so it's approval response outcome. That's what we want to know, so that we set the approval response variable to that value. Oh, it worked. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So there's this editor which allows you to kind of do string functions or select dynamic content that's available in this particular scope in the program. So it gradually became clear that you can do a lot of things, but the way that you get to do them is a little bit peculiar sometimes. And it's got this expression language with functions and with reference to other nodes that have already been executed and their outcomes. So, you know, I ask myself, why go to that extent? If you want basically non-professionals to be able to design workflows, then yeah, okay, this nodes and arcs type of approach is probably good, but in order to make this work properly, you need to have a degree in computer science, because you need to understand how these expressions work and how to structure a workflow or an algorithm in such a way that you've covered all of the possible cases. So that probably is just about enough. What I'll do is I'll upload. No, actually, what I'll do is I'll show you by going back. There's some runs that I tested this just before I came out. Okay, so if I actually open that, this is the debugger effectively, right? It shows us what happened. So we can say, okay, let's have a look at that. There's some inputs. You can show the raw inputs as JSON. So it said, look in the test asset library, and the operation is get on updated file item. And what was the output? Well, here's the output. It's got so many headers and this body. And the important thing was that somewhere down here, it tells you the name of the document, who modified it. So this is the person who uploaded it. Yeah, no, this is the owner. Whoever uploads it tends to be, no, actually it's blank to begin with, but it's a required field. So I just put myself in as owner for that. And various other properties. So we know all about the properties of the item that's just uploaded, including its name. So this is actually the presentation that I'm giving you now. I uploaded that as a test. Okay, and if any of these nodes failed or got skipped, like the catch block got skipped because it wasn't executed, it wasn't needed. But if any of these nodes failed, you see a red X, and then you can dig into that and find out what the service that was invoked returned. And you can go around again, try and fix that. In some cases, it's because the permission token that, the access token that you're using to access the service has expired. And I'll come on to that when we get to the gotchas. So any questions so far? Okay. So if we go back to the presentation. Wherever it's gone. Oh, here we are. So what is Power Automate? There's a little piece of video. Watch. Come to the video later. I didn't actually choose to share sound, which is just as well. Let's say, what's Power Automate in a nutshell? Well, it's process automation or process orchestration, which allows you to orchestrate any Microsoft services and indeed third-party services that are available in the cloud. There's a large number of kind of third-party connectors that's available in the palette of tools. In this case, we just use the Microsoft ones. So JSON objects are used to represent the actual process steps and their connections. The steps are called actions. You can use any number of inputs in an action, but only one output, which can be a complex object. It's all point and click, as you saw. There is some AI support. You can take a template that exists already and adapt it, or design a flow from scratch. You don't need to install any tools at all on your desktop. It's just fully browser-based, which is probably an advantage, which means everybody working on that project has exactly the same tools at their fingertips. But the major drawbacks, I didn't find any unit test framework. There is a sort of static check when you come to save a workflow. It'll immediately tell you if it's valid or not, according to its lights. But that really only covers connections within the within that graph. So it checks that you haven't got any loose dangling ends, and you haven't got any incorrect parameter types to function calls and that kind of thing. Out of the box, there's no version control either. So as soon as you've changed the workflow, unfortunately, there's no way of going back to say, oh, I didn't mean that. So, and for anything that's got the slightest amount of complexity to it, you need to use the functional expression language that they provide, which is completely proprietary. Also, if you're trying to use certain APIs on some services, including some Microsoft services, they don't provide out of the box connector tool to use that. You have to use a very generic custom HTTP request node and specify absolutely everything about it. Just about the only thing it does is to provide you with the authentication token. It does that automatically. Some more drawbacks. As I showed you, the debugger, the logging and diagnosis is very good, but you can't actively debug. So you have to always kind of let the workflow proceed and then go back and see what happened. I'll come to the ownership questions and credentials later. There are code comments actually. You can attach code comments to an action, but it took us quite a few weeks before we discovered this. There's an obscure little button in the top right-hand corner in which you can insert something. It's a bit like a reply in one of these social media type. Yeah, it's a bit like a Facebook. And there's also different types of flows, something called desktop flows, which you can execute locally, but you need a premium license to use them. This is where the video comes in. Somebody's asking me something in chat. Oh, yeah, I think actually, yes. Richard, you asked whether we use GitHub Copilot on Microsoft 365 Copilot. I'm sure it's the latter. Thanks for asking. I need to share audio as well. So I'm going to do that. I think I might have to share again. Options, share sound. Okay. Let's see if we can do this thing.
Organization. You can use cloud flows, desktop flows, or business process flows. Cloud flows has three options. They are automated cloud flow, instant cloud flow, and scheduled cloud flow. Automated cloud triggered by an event such as an arrival of an email from a specific person. Instant cloud flows can start an automation with the click of a button. Scheduled cloud flows can start a scheduled automation such as a daily upload to SharePoint or a database. Desktop flows broadens the existing robotic process automation capabilities in Power Automate and enables you to automate all repetitive processes. You have three options to make a desktop flow. They are Power Automate Desktop, Selenium IDE or Integrated Development Environment, and Windows Recorder. Power Automate Desktop allows you to enjoy a new and easy way to record your manual tasks and run them as automate flows. In addition, you can pick from hundreds of pre-built drag and drop actions to create your own automations. Selenium IDE allows you to use this open source tool to record web flows. Finally, Windows Record is used to create desktop flows. Business process flows standardizes those business processes and eliminates guesswork. This is accomplished by entering data consistently, following the same steps every single time. In Power Automate, you can go to My Flows, and there you can see the different Power Automate flow options. There's the cloud flow.
Sorry, I had to turn my loudspeaker on in order to share the sound with the rest of the conference. It wasn't too bad. Okay, so I'm going to stop this video now. Go on to the next slide. Okay, so you've probably got the idea that there are a number of ways of triggering flows. One is, automatic based on one of these triggers that looks at files and assets on the cloud. For example, in SharePoint. There's one that you can actually just trigger manually by programming a button somewhere on a page. And there's ones that you can trigger on a timed basis. So 12 o'clock every night, do this thing. We found documentation quite difficult. I mean, Microsoft does provide you with that link there, but it's all very fragmented. You can't get a very good sense of how it all hangs together and how to get around certain problems. So we did a lot of Googling and looking in Stack Overflow and such things. But eventually I discovered this site, Process.st, which is a company that actually specializes in automating workflows for companies. And if you look on their site and look for Power Automate, it's full of good advice. So that's what I recommend. Before I come on to the development environment, are there further questions?
Would it be easier to work with from a technical perspective if you had the skills to just bypass that front end?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Correct. And that, after working on this project for some months, on and off, I came to the conclusion that it might have been a lot easier to do it in Python, for example, and just to invoke the APIs directly. Shall we have a look at pizzas? We had 6 people in the room. So I suggest we go for 2 large pizzas and 2 sides. Yeah. Shall we go for choose a pizza? I quite like the veggie supreme because
that's good. It's real food. Yeah. As opposed to plant-based something or other.
Yeah. And the second one is for Texas barbecue. And something called Meteor, large portion of barbecue sauce, top of the pork meatballs. There's something called Chicken Feast, that's always good. Or ranch barbecue, which is also chicken with barbecue sauce, pepperoni, ground beef, bacon.
Chicken, the second one was there.
Pardon?
The second one of the chickens?
The second one, okay, ranch barbecue, yeah, okay.
Oh, no,
Huh?
ranch barbecue? Which one doesn't have pork?
Which one doesn't have pork?
Yeah.
Something called chicken feast.
Yeah, that's the one. Chicken, right? No,
Chicken's fine.
barbecue and all this other stuff, right?
Yeah.
We can choose some sides, garlic pizza bread, potato wedges.
Yeah, potato wedges, they're like fries, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, those go down well. Yeah, yeah.
It does, yeah, I don't know, the potato wedges to the best side, if not, they'll be quite good.
Potato fries, we have our dish, potato wedges and fries.
That's cool.
Okay, and the dessert, twisted dough balls, chocolate cinnamon. Sound good? Probably about 6 portions in there. Okay, let's go. Right. So when you get to the basket. So this won't take long now. Continue to basket. Delivery. Any allergies? Okay. Delivery time. Should we say 8 o'clock? Good. 7:45, because I'm going to finish before then.
Well,
Okay.
it'll be 7:45 and then it'll be here,
Yeah.
so when we get out.
Where do we have to go?
It's 49.
9 o'clock.
No.
Okay, well, we're a small group, mind you, we're right here $2, but still.
Okay, the order's gone in.
Disappointed there, though, isn't it?
I'll carry on. I've shown you a little bit of the development environment already. But this is how we coped with the fact that there is no unit test framework. So we created this test repository site. And basically everything about it is the same as the database schema, the columns and so forth, including the choice values. So whenever we change it in one place, we have to change it in the other one as well. The 3 workflows are the same ones. We developed and tested and debugged the workflows in the one site and the test environment, so we wouldn't interfere with anybody else who's using the live site. And then we have to copy the changes across. So I found it useful to have a big screen with the workflow in test and workflow in live, copy stuff across. But you have to be really, really careful because you don't necessarily copy everything identically. I showed you already the timeout nodes, for example, where you're waiting for an approval for up to 5 minutes in the test, but you want to wait up to 2 days in the real life. And that's obviously too slow for testing. The other thing that tends to copy incorrectly is credentials. So whereas you might be using a test user account in the test site to connect to SharePoint, you want to be using a service user account in the live site. That sort of thing. Next slide. There isn't a version control system, and I found this a real bugbear. It meant that you had to make changes in very small incremental steps in case you broke anything. You can apparently export a workflow in a basically zipped set of JSON, and you can import them again. So that's your ultimate safety copy. Microsoft doesn't recommend that, well, they wouldn't, would they? Because they want you to subscribe to the Power Platform, which contains your own Dataverse database, and then you can implement so-called solutions in Dataverse, which contains application lifecycle management, so version control, everything is there then. I haven't tried that. This was an internal project with no budget, so you have to take what's given. So this was my approach and my colleague's approach when we're trying to work with this stuff. you work with, you upload the workflow in the test area, you save it, you trigger it, you see what happened, rinse and repeat. And as I mentioned, the workflows in the test environment have shorter timeouts. So that has a funny side effect, which is that particularly on the delete trigger, the shortest we found that we could set the sampling interval was 5 minutes. And because our timeout was only 5 minutes, there were occasions when, you know, the propagation delays in output meant that by the time you got the approval request, it had timed out. So you have to be really quick. And the last section is the longest one with all the watches. So any questions at this point?
If you're going to import from zip, how do you then simultaneously adapt it from test environment to production environment in terms of credentials, links, and
No, I wasn't suggesting that you actually export from test and import into production. No, it's just an ultimate way of kind of keeping a safety copy of your workflow before you make any major change.
Sorry.
okay. So if you're using,
Yes.
if you're using the manual approach,
Yeah.
copying over, how do you create a list of all the differences so that you can copy over?
There's
no
two ways.
audit.
There's two ways. I'll come to mention that actually. I can't remember where it comes to it, so I'll mention it. I'll explain now. So you can actually copy nodes and entire scopes from one side to the other side, but then you have everything that's copied has got copy after it, so you have to go back through and change the name, and that's important because there's no referential integrity. So if one of your nodes says, I want the output of such and such an action, actually I tell you, like, if you use that as a reference variable, it's fine, but if you use it inside one of these expressions, it won't change it. So you have to make sure that after you copy that stuff, you've gone back and renamed everything the way it was in the original workflow. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it, if you're just changing something within a node, I typically just copy the expression. That, you know, so variable name such and such. But sometimes you have to watch out because the owner of that action might be a different owner, so you need different credentials, that kind of stuff. It is tedious, but you get to know what to look out for, because when you first try and run it, it won't work.
Could you get hold of the zip and modify the code in the zip and then import that back in?
So you could.
Right, okay.
I haven't tried that. It's probably worth at least bearing in mind. You know, you could diff the zip from the live site with the one that you've exported and see what differences there are, and then you have to decide which ones to copy across.
Okay, cool.
Variables, as I mentioned, are global, so you can only initialize them essentially declaration at global scope. But they do have something called, there's 6 types of variable. There's booleans, integers, floats, strings, and something called object, which is complex. And you can have an array of any of those. So yeah, initializes essentially the declaration with an initial value. You can set it, you can, for the numerical types, you can increment and decrement.
We do have a question. How do scopes work in Power Automate? Can then define flows to work only within certain scopes?
Yes, as I mentioned before, you use scopes as a way of delimiting the effect of something. So you saw it in the case of the try and catch block. So I made a scope for the try, and then on any failure within that block, it falls through to the catch block because of the way that you say run after. So that's one way to use it, but also if you code something like for each or an if then else, that kind of thing, it automatically creates a scope for you within there. But can we define flows to work only within a certain scope? I'm not sure I understand the concept. I mean, subsections of a flow will be within the scope. And if they terminate normally or abnormally, you can have different outcome or scopes. Thanks for the question. Yeah, so depending on the type of the variable, you can increment or decrement it. Those are numerical types, or if they're string, you can append. You can also append to arrays. But arrays goes further because there's a specific create array action. So you can create arrays of objects that way. And that kind of is a bad smell to me. It suggests that the language is not sort of very well designed, that you need a special action for arrays of objects. But they've more recently come up with something called compose, which is kind of neat because it substitutes for scoped variables. So you can compose a string by having various dynamic expressions interspersed within an overall string, and out comes a completed string. It's a bit like using dollar variables in Bash. If anybody's familiar with that. And so long as you stay in the same scope as that compose, then you can reference it by name and its outcome, and use that in further actions. This is another gotcha. When you first insert a node or an action into the workflow, Power Automate tries to assign it the same name as it has on the palette of tools. But of course, if you've got more than one of those, you will have to rename it. Typically, I think Power Automate just adds a numerical digit towards the end. So when you look at a workflow and it just says initialize variable 2, initialize variable 3, it's not very helpful. So I've come up with some naming conventions. On the action, you typically, if it interfaces to an online service, then it'll have an icon that sort of indicates what service it relates to. It's gradually learn what they look like. If you look at the code view, then its type might be, but not always, obvious from the JSON. So I suggest name it based on the type. So if you've got an initialized variable action, call it initialized variable XYZ or something like that. So giving the name of the variable that's being initialized. So when you're looking at the workflow, you know what's happening. In a for loop, I suggest calling it for each something or other. Yeah, the action is actually of type apply to each, which you, again, apply to each one, apply to each two, and so forth. It's not very meaningful. And again, for branches, I think, use the predicate as the name. So if approval granted, and then within that node, within the approval granted node, you'll have a yes and a no branch, each of which is in the scope again. In the flow editor, yeah, this is an interesting one. You saw that there were cloud flows, and I think there's 3 categories. But there's, you see a tab saying My Flows, and so after you create a new one, there it is. You go into the overview page and say, I want this to be co-owned by other members of my team, and then afterwards, oh, it's not there anymore. Lost it. And you look under shared flows shared with me, and suddenly there it is. So that caught us out early on. It takes quite a while because this is all based in the browser with JavaScript. It's quite slow to open these flows, you know, until it's built the whole picture. Takes a little while. And saving takes a little while as well. As I showed you, this expression editor can sometimes work if you click on something on the left-hand side in the definition of that action, but sometimes it doesn't, and you just have to hover over it and see what it says. And this is particularly tedious when you're trying to copy changes you've made in the test side over to the live side. You have to kind of hover the cursor over it, remember what it said, or just screenshot and type that into the other one. Yeah, as I said, copy is always added, and also you have the parameters and settings. So it really helps if you have identical naming for actions in each of the workflows. And as I said, saving can take, you know, between 5 and 10 seconds, but it's worth it if you muck it up. You can at least just abandon that and come back. I've also found, because of the slowness of updating the screen, if you click on something in the top right hand corner, and that then is supposed to take away the little menu that you just clicked on, but you're not sure it's done it because it hasn't responded fast enough. You click again, and suddenly you've engaged with a completely different control, which switches you back from the new design view to the classic, which looks a bit clunky. So I feel like that's what I've done. Right, this is a kind of a slight speed up. We were doing things triggered on file conditions. So, for example, if a file had been checked in, that means that it's been changed. By the way, checking in and checking out is something that you have to specifically set on library settings in SharePoint. If you, by default, everybody that clicks on a file will open it. And anyone that clicks on a file would have opened it for edit, and that completely messes up the audit trail, which is one of the reasons why we insisted on checking out. But the users find it difficult to understand that. They're used to SharePoint just letting you edit anything at any time. So we have to educate them to, in this particular instance, that there is something to be something additional that you need to do before you can change the content of the file or its properties. Supposing you tested a workflow, it's triggered in the normal way and didn't work, or whatever, so the condition of that file which triggered it hasn't changed, then you can re-trigger the workflow, and that's much quicker than waiting for the trigger to happen again. In most cases, supposing you've moved a file to the waste bin, then you need to pull it back and delete it again so as to trigger that flow. Something about notifications, yes. So when we create an approval and post the card afterwards, that hits multiple services. So you get an output in Outlook, you get one in Teams workflows, and you get a further one in Teams approvals. So they look different. In some cases, they support Markdown, and that's really nice. So you can embed things like HTML links. But when you do a pure send an email, it's just exactly what you put into the in the content string. So we had to improvise a little bit, because Outlook, if it finds something that looks like a URL in a mail just as text, it will render it as a URL and you can click on it. So we had to be a bit creative in how we format these things. The other thing we found was, yeah, you remember that we made owner into a compulsory field. But of course, there were a lot of documents that didn't have an owner yet when we imported them. originally. And so we had an algorithm that said, well, if there's no owner, then send it to all of the single points of contact. At that time, I wasn't aware just how many business units would be affected by that. And that means we discovered that the Spocs were getting hundreds of messages a day and they were just ignoring them. So we needed to cut down that quite radically. And the way we did it was to say, well, when you specify the owner, and the owner is now compulsory, then you must name one of the single points of contact at least as one of the owners. So that means that it's then restricted to just contacting them. And we had to make the wording of these messages extremely explicit, you know, saying you've been asked to review this document, click here, that sort of thing. And do it before such and such a date as well. That's quite important. There's still confusion when the recipients receive these things. So they need to know how they can do it. Oh, yes, also initially we found, I'll come on to that people didn't actually have access to the documents they were supposed to review. That wasn't helpful. We managed to work out ways of actually pointing them directly to the relevant document. Excuse me, please. Hello? Hello? Yeah. Is it Domino's pizza delivery? Oh. Yeah, sorry, I can't really understand you, but yeah, we're waiting for these pizzas. We should be getting them in about 15 minutes.
I think he said he's outside and can he come up?
Okay, would somebody like to?
Timo, I'm going in there. No worries, leave it for me.
Somebody's coming. Somebody's coming.
I'm joking.
Okay. Yeah, we worked out a way of actually. Okay, right. We found a way of actually linking the email message you get into the document library in such a way that it pick out just the one document. And that was quite a breakthrough, really, because before that, people were searching for these documents among hundreds of others and not finding them. And the last thing, you can't do anything about it in designing the workflow. That's just a question of education. So, you know, why have we got these procedures there? What quality targets are we trying to achieve with them? So we're now embarking on a series of educational sessions where we can tell users how to work with this stuff. Token troubles, I mentioned that before. So there's a connection. Well, there's many connections between the workflow and the cloud service. There's a long-lived token that authorizes these, but after about a month of disuse, they expire. And then you have to re-authenticate. So it tends to happen more in the test area, because if you're not doing any testing for a while, you know, some of these tokens will have just expired, but it can happen in the live one if there's some sort of branch on the workflow that doesn't happen very often. And the only person who can actually regenerate that token is the individual with the password and credentials to log in as that user into Microsoft AD, Active Directory. So we've got a very small number of service accounts with, yeah, if you're a normal user, you typically have to use multi-factor authentication, so it can't re-authenticate you automatically. But service accounts very much frowned upon by the IT department, because if you use them too much, you know, that password could leak and it doesn't automatically rotate. So, yeah, handle with caution. I think actually that would apply also, Stephen, if you used any other orchestration methods such as Python. Yeah, as I said, focus Canton up. And then the workflow will fail, and you'll get a message saying, you know, this catch block was entered. Here's the reason. Well, it doesn't actually tell you the reason. We did manage to embed a link to the workflow within the failure message, so that when you get that email, you can just click on it and see the debug, and then it says, "Ah, okay, we've got 503 or something like that." Try to invoke that particular connection. So yes, errors do occur, and they surprise you sometimes. So, for example, we had something that's fully debugged and working. It would say get user profile in order to find out their email address or something like that. But if that user had left the company and their account had been deleted, then you suddenly got it blowing up. So that's why we needed to put these catch blocks on. As I said before, when you go to the settings tab of a particular action, you can tailor the retry strategy to avoid enormously long timeouts, and that's particularly important when you're testing stuff in the test environment. But having set it like that, it's important to copy the same settings across to the live one, and that's actually one of the pitfalls. You know, when you're copying stuff from one environment to the other, if you changed anything other than on the first overview, say in the settings, you need to copy that as well. Code comment. And so the discovery of scopes was incredibly important to get this stuff to work properly.
There's a question, because you mentioned scope, that someone asked, how do scopes work in Power Automation?
Yeah, I've answered that one, Olivia.
Oh, okay.
The other sort of pragmatic thing to do is, in many cases, you've got a series of actions which could yield the same value that you might want to use further down the flow. In which case, the obvious thing to do is to go as far back as you can in the workflow. Because by the time you get to the next node, it's possible that one of the in-between ones would have failed to retrieve that. So just always go to the ultimate source of truth. Yeah, that's it. So failure conditions are cumulative. So if within a scope you've actually had a if then else branch to handle the failure conditions, it still applies to the scope as a whole as well. So you need to make sure if you want to carry on flowing after that, that you add all the failure conditions that you might want to ignore as the condition for running that node. As I say, we're reporting failures by email. And we're including a link to the workflow instance, and we have to think carefully about who should be notified that it's failed. At the moment, it's basically me and one other person supporting this workflow, because the single point of contact was just not interested. Yeah, even the subject line of the notification. So we now include the document name within the notification heading, so that people know which thing they're talking about. And you should say, please approve, or something like that. Visibility, yeah. So this is what I mentioned before. Before we did this later change, people sometimes found that a newly uploaded file that didn't have access. And for a long time we couldn't figure out why. But when they tried to click on the link to the document, it would take them to a page that said, you don't have access to this document, please request access. So they click request access, and then the originator, no, actually it was an administrator of the site, which is me, would get a message saying so-and-so has requested access. You click on a link and it says, oh, all the people who requested access to certain documents. So you'd either grant or refuse it. And that worked fine. But if somebody changed an existing document, the person who was supposed to review it still didn't have access to the new version, so they couldn't do it. And we eventually worked out what it was.
Here we have another question. How easily can you leverage your learning on this project to use structures in a new project? Can you create templates?
Well, really, that's what I'm doing. The templates for workflows are not something that we can modify. They're supplied by Microsoft. So the best thing we can do is share a workflow and let people copy it, make another version of that. Yeah, sorry, I've lost my flow now.
Sorry.
No, not sorry. But really what I'm trying to do is capture the learnings into this slide deck, and if people would like to see the slide deck later, I can make it available. So SharePoint, we found, discovered that it supports different options for visibility, and the obvious one to choose is it should be visible, i.e. a draft version that's not been approved yet, should be visible to the author and the approvers. Right? But then it turns out that approvers doesn't mean what you think it means. It means the site administrators, rather than the people who we've listed as the created approval action approvers. So then we set about working out how to give those people access. And it turns out you can do it. So within the workflow now, we actually add the approvers into the list of permitted roles on the file. And we found that the minimum amount of level you can give them is design role. And once they have that, then they can access the drafts of that document as well. So that means they actually avoid the need to explicitly request access because it's already given. So then they can open the file for approval purposes and they can see the properties. Right, let's come into the conclusions. Power Automate, I think, is very robust. I've never seen it crash. And it's quite capable. So that's important. We'll come to questions in a minute.
Okay. I'll come.
It is quite slow in execution. If you look at the timings on one of these debug runs, you can see that many nodes took large fractions of a second or even several seconds to execute because they have to go over the internet to access the services in the background. And as I said, the editor is not lightning fast. I think that my conclusion is you really do need to be an expert computer programmer to understand what's going on in these workflows and design them robustly. And I think if I was asked to do another similar type of system in the future, I'd think using a proper high-level language where you can do some unit testing, you can have version control and all the rest of the things that we're used to. That brings me to the end of this presentation. Let's have a look at the questions. Somebody says, can you create templates? And the answer is, unfortunately, we can't. There's pre-supplied, but we can make people, give people access to existing workflows that we've designed. I recommend using distribution lists to allow you to manage recipient changes. Yes, that's more or less what we're doing. Thanks, Barbara. We do have a distribution list called Spot, that we use that for the single points of contact if we want to address all of them. But actually, we found it's easier to load a group into the workflow and then filter it to include just the people we want, rather than spamming everyone. So the usefulness of distribution lists is questionable. More questions? Yeah.
Is there any provision for hierarchy in the flows, like flows and subflows, to provide modularity, or is it all just copy paste boilerplate type stuff?
Yeah, I think these workflows that I've shown you are getting towards the limit of complexity that I want to support. And there certainly is a possibility to trigger one flow from another flow. You can do it in a number of ways. You can actually say as a trigger for one workflow, look at the output of another one, or you can explicitly kick off a workflow, and that's the way the time zones are done, I think. What is the pedigree of this technology? Is it related to Windows Workflow Foundation? I suspect it is. I don't know for sure. We've found, certainly if you go into Microsoft Azure DevOps and you use their Git repository and their pipelines, they're straight out of Teams Foundation. What's it called? Windows Team Foundation, something like that.
That talk came before.
Team Foundation Server, TFS. Yeah. So it's quite likely that they expanded and embraced it, just adapted what they've got to make something reasonably serviceable. So I'd use it for simple things. What we've done is probably at the limit of what it's capable of supporting, really.
I think I have one final question. When you mentioned Spock, Richard assumes you meant a single person and not a group of Spocks.
Yeah, what we have is we've got in Zühlke we have a number of practices which are global. So my practice is called Cloud DevOps and Quality. Each one had to nominate a single point of contact who was kind of the senior reviewer for that market unit or practice. It's sort of working. We've had sessions with most of them to explain what this is about, and they're getting used to the idea that if they get one of these notifications, they ought to do something about it really within this week.
What's the limit of scale would you imagine these workflows can handle? What sort of volumes would you
come close to it? I mean, there's the entire Azure cloud behind it, isn't there? So all of the services that we're invoking run on that infrastructure.
Would too many workflows impair a business? Could you go overboard?
I'm sure you could. I hadn't really thought about that. Yeah, I mean, every time you invoke a workflow, you want it to interact with people to do something. So when that happens, they get a notification in Teams and or in Outlook, and it interrupts their train of thought at that point. People have to be disciplined to kind of turn that off, go into there's some kind of a isolation mode, isn't there? You can switch your Microsoft environment to not interrupt you. So you have to be disciplined about that and allocate times of day when you can do this. Yeah, I'd like to thank you.